All right. Hello, my name is Sophia Hagalani-Albov. I work with the Global Extractivisms and Alternatives Initiative, and I am also helping out with some of the Global South theme. I'm going to give you a few short logistical announcements for this morning's Global South Encounter, and then I will turn the floor over. The HELSUS Global South Encounters is a series of seminars and small talks intended to sharpen critical research in sustainability science. The talks recognize the complexity and particularities of the Global South. These seminars engage mainstream sustainability science in order to transcend it, among others by decolonizing nature, economy, society, and methodologies. However, the stories from the Global South do not just end here, and I would like to take just a moment to proudly announce the recently launched Just Ecological Political Economy, which is the HELSUS Global South blog, which seeks to develop the aims of the Global South webinars. It's a space of ideas, policy, and action to enable much needed voices to be heard and engaged. And I will link that down in the chat when I turn the floor over. And I'm also going to put a link to our social media space that we're using with the Helsinki Global South theme. So as mentioned, the webinar today is being recorded. While the presentation is going on, we're going to have first the presentation and then a Q&A session. While the presentation is going on, we want to really encourage you to use the chat space in Zoom to make comments, to ask questions. Anytime they come up, you feel welcome to use that chat space. And then when we move into the actual Q&A time, we'll pull questions both from the chat, or if you'd like to ask a question with your voice, we ask you to please use the raise hand function, and our chair, Pirjo, will invite you to speak. And of course, we will try to get to all questions, but this is a short time. Speaking of, I'm going to stop talking, and I would like to turn the floor over to our chair, Pirjo.
Thank you so much, Sophia, and everyone. I really wish you a beautiful morning. We have this beautiful morning in Helsinki, but our guest, Joffre Balce, is having a winter cold winter day in other side of the planet. We are very pleased to have you, Joffre, here, and I will say a few words. Joffre Balce is the secretary of the Association for Good Government in Sydney. He has a background in law. He has a master's degree from the University of Asia and Pacific in Manila. He has also carried out PhD studies in law, and he's a specialist in property law. And he's been working with indigenous peoples in Philippines and in Australia. He was born in Manila, so he is really drawing his studies from his own perspectives and has this personal connection to the work that he's doing. Today we will have really refreshing point that he's making about the property law through especially a person. He will introduce the person and his theory that is the basis for his arguments, and I'm sure this will give for us lots of food for thought. So thank you so much, Joffre, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ria, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. This is the afternoon in Sydney, but wherever you are at any time of your day, thank you. This was a topic given, and I will tackle it, but not go too much into detail, because I would like to encourage everyone to read the paper when it gets published, and that's where it will contain. I can skim over the details during the presentations. If you want to ask more details in the course of after the presentation, or if you want to inject it in the chat box, please do so, and I will respond later. Next slide, please. And before I begin, I'd first like to express my deepest gratitude and acknowledgement first to my co-author, Dr. Yogiswaran Subramaniam. He's one of the renowned indigenous peoples law specialist in Southeast Asia, very well published and very actively involved in the plight of the Orang Asli in Malaysia. We were colleagues in the Faculty of Law of the University of New South Wales, where he completed his PhD in law, and I have yet to complete mine. I also want to express thanks to Dr. Franklin Obeng Udum for his confidence that we can rise to the occasion and the challenge that he set for us on this very, very awesome topic. The American Journal of Economics and Sociology for the rigorous and vigorous exchange and in the course of the peer review, which was also very useful in educating me about the indigenous people situation. The Association for Good Government, who took me into their fold in 2007, of which I'm now the secretary, and for the knowledge resources they have extended to me with regard to Georgism. And the HELSUS Global South Encounters for this opportunity to present, to briefly discuss the paper. Next slide, please. I also want to dedicate and at the same time express the purpose of why we wrote the paper and is making this presentation. One is for the indigenous people whom we know of and those who we don't know in the rest of the world. The indigenous peoples are quite close to my family because during the Second World War, the first to volunteer for the resistance against the Japanese were the indigenous peoples, the Abian. And I have also worked with the Dumagats in Luzon and the Blaan and the Tibolis in Mindanao, as well as the Manobos. The second purpose and reason I'd like to dedicate this presentation and paper is for Henry George and the movement, which is his legacy. Its rigorous and continuing pursuit of social justice through equality and rights for all people, not just the indigenous peoples. However, I would like to also highlight that he has mentioned the plight of the indigenous peoples of Native America in his classic Progress and Poverty. I also want to dedicate this to the discipline of political economy and economics and their practitioners in order to reflect on our discipline, reflect over our methods, and evaluate our rigor with regard to the pursuit of social justice, especially in what I feel to be an under-discussed issue. And I would like to also dedicate this to and encourage everyone who would like to choose to deepen the discourse on this very important topic. Next slide, please. So in our paper, it will discuss who are the indigenous peoples. And we source the various official documents in international law that defines and provides and recognizes the indigenous peoples as having a unique context because of their unbroken line from the pre-colonial times to the present, be it cultural, economic, political, and traditional. The paper also addresses the concern and the concern and definition of their rights as indigenous peoples, not just as human beings, given their unique context and the unique experience in which they have encountered colonialization, imperialism, and living in modern times. And third is the paper also contains the various conventions and institutions that recognize and endeavor to protect their rights and to recognize them. The other area is also discusses economic imperialism and defines it in terms not just of its history, but its legacy, its consequences. Legacy and consequences that are lasting and ongoing up to this very day. And part of it deals with the Georgist concern about private property in land. The idea of land ownership of the indigenous peoples is far different from the idea of private property in land that we are familiar with, and which is the predominant school of thought in law around the world. And we believe, like Henry George would, is crucial to understanding the situation of the indigenous peoples with regard to their dispossession. And this presentation looks at how economic imperialism is enacted through the dispossession of indigenous peoples of their traditional lands. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the indigenous land dispossession, we look at it in terms of the economic challenge. Although this is not a Keynesian paper, Keynes has pretty much declared the challenges of economics as achieving economic efficiency, pursuing social justice, and enhancing individual liberty. Many times they are thought of as trade-offs, but we have taken the approach and the perspective that it is not a matter of trade-offs, trading one off for the other, but integrating all three as not being contradictory. We would like to raise the concern that it is a matter of integrating all three. And that is even a bigger challenge. And we would be using the perspective and philosophy of Henry George and his idea of indigeneity, which he has mentioned in his book, Progress and Poverty, that the indigenous peoples, or he called them the red people of the United States, have been marginalized in very much the same way the poor in the cities have been marginalized because of private property in land. So we evaluate economic efficiency in terms of the Georgist idea that exchange is not a distributive mechanism, but as a mode of production. And let me discuss this in a bit of detail. Henry George describes production as having three modes. And when we talk about production, we talk about the production of wealth. And wealth as being the produce of economic activity in order to address or meet human needs or wants. The first mode of production being extraction, such extraction from the land, be it mining or mineral resources extraction, or farming, from which you would extract fruits, crops when you harvest after cultivating them. The second mode of production would be what you describe as transformation, where you change the form of one substance into another, such as turning strawberries into jam, turning fibers into clothes, turning metal ore into tools or ingots. And the third mode of production is exchange. And exchange is what Henry George considers as the highest form of production, because while the nature of the goods and services being exchanged does not change, it remains as they are, their ability to meet human needs or human wants is increased in such a way. Like my favorite example is if a tea drinker during a company or school raffle, if a tea drinker wins coffee and a coffee drinker receives tea, they will not be as satisfied with the drink that they will prepare for themselves unless they exchange the tea for coffee or coffee for tea. That way, the tea drinker gets tea and enjoys his drink more, and the coffee drinker gets coffee and enjoys the drink more. The coffee and the tea have not changed, but their ability to satisfy human needs have increased. And that matches the idea of economic efficiency proposed by Vilfredo Pareto, which I will simplify in my own words as the optimal positive sum outcome of an exchange. The second aspect of which is social justice is the equality in rights in the treatments of indigenous peoples, especially to the land on which they occupy. In the colonial times, we see that equality is lost when the military or coercive might of the colonizer or the imperialist is exercised or asserted against the weakness of the indigenous peoples. And that continues today, we feel, in the area of law in which the modern laws are imposed against the will and understanding of the indigenous peoples. And that affects adversely their ability of self-determination, which we will discuss more deeply later. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we're talking about applications of Georgist philosophy, I have discussed that it is in the perspective of exchange as a mode of production, social justice as equality in rights and their application, and self-determination in the freedom of association over the land they occupy, the traditional lands, and their power to use that land and plan its further use. Our paper points out that dispossession is inefficient because it is not the optimal positive sum outcome. Sure, one may argue that positive sum outcomes may have been achieved, but it is not optimal. Many times it is worse that it is not a positive sum outcome because it is at the cost of marginalizing and dispossessing indigenous peoples of their land and even forcing them to accept land of lower value, or a naive assumption that the money that they will be receiving in compensation for the land loss will be enough to compensate that loss and achieve a higher level of existence. Many times that does not happen. The second is the asymmetries or the unfair relationships in legal, economic, and financial frameworks. Many times, sometimes the indigenous peoples are viewed as wasting the opportunity of the better use of the land. And this is a controversy, I understand, among Georgists, but the question arises, who is to judge the best use of the land, especially if a people living on them really rely on their very existence on living in the land, their cultural, traditional, and even aspirational aspects. Economic frameworks are applied to them, such as what I described, such as utilitarian standards, where as long as the society achieves the greatest good for the greatest number and the least harm to the least number is achieved. But that is not economic efficiency. That is utilitarian. And lastly is the financial frameworks that could be applied to the disadvantage of the less moneyed, normally less moneyed indigenous peoples. And also their ability to reason on the basis of financial and accounting frameworks. This leads to the denial of indigenous liberties and their development on their terms, because they are, what is asserted is an inferiority of their position with regard to the aspects I just mentioned. And in the process, they have lost their freedom, and injustice and inequality is worsened. Next slide, please. So we believe that starting points of convergence of Georgism and currents in international law can begin through participatory protections for efficiency, justice, and indigenous empowerment. We believe that these should be good criteria to pursue in exercising the participatory protections provided by international law. The second is acknowledge and realize and recognize the declaration of injustices suffered by indigenous people across history, and that at least the compensation of that historical injustice is addressed and or at least not repeated ever. The third is calling out of the free riding on declarations of terra nullius, and properly measuring rather than assuming the burdens and costs and harms and benefits borne by two negotiating parties. Many times you will hear that indigenous peoples are in the way of progress, and that is unfair. We must also realize or understand the perspective of value, especially in terms of an existential value to the indigenous peoples, which is very difficult, if not impossible, to monetize. And enhance free, prior, and informed consent of the people, of the indigenous peoples, through knowledge, awareness, and the deepening of the Georgist philosophy from their perspective. Rather, and this could be even a greater challenge to the Georgists coming from a modern or contemporary urban perspective. Next slide, please. And the challenges. One is, it is observed that the indigenous people's empowerment appears to be a low economic priority. It's more a question that must be pursued. It's difficult for us to make the conclusion, but there are signs that it could be a low economic priority, not just in industrialized countries, but also in the global South. Many times, in the global South, it is the locals, the natives, that are the nationals that are oppressing their very own indigenous peoples. And I have personally seen that in the Philippines. The second challenge is ecological crises and the demand for resilience to extreme weathers under climate change make the empowerment of indigenous peoples, who are the first to be adversely affected because they are dispossessed, when they are dispossessed, a frontier of defense. Because if you defend, we manage to defend and assert indigenous people's rights to their land, then we are able to also protect the rest of the world from the deepening ecological crises. The third is, I mentioned it earlier, integrating Georgist concepts that will enhance the quality of free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous people's engagement. If the indigenous peoples can talk back in terms that economics, finance, and law will understand on the areas of economic efficiency, social justice, and sovereignty, individual liberties, then they have a better chance of asserting and defending their own interests. And the fourth challenge is an open dialogue to a common understanding of political economy, wealth, and a universal connection to land and resources, which is exactly what Henry George had been advocating in his works, and many Georgists continue to do so. So I think that's the last slide. Thank you very much, Sophia. And I think, Pirio, I will open. We can now open our floor to questions and further discussions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Joffre. That was really, really great to learn more about this Georgian idea of law. So my first question is, I think it would be very good for all the people here present today to know a little bit more about Henry George. So if you could explain a little bit more, like if you know about the genealogy of his concepts, where did they come? It would be really interesting to know where did he study, what was his contact with the indigenous peoples in North America, and so on. Could we start with that elaboration first? Thanks.
All right, thank you very much for that question. Henry George is probably the best-selling political economist in the 19th century, having sold over 2 million books in his in that period. He did not even finish high school. At 15, he stowed away on a ship. And so you can consider him a self-educated person. And but he loved to read. And when he returned to the US, and he married quite young, after experiencing severe poverty, it gave him an insight to the experience of poverty himself, and he did not wish it for any person. So he said, I will go and try, I will seek livelihood. I will find a job and lift myself out of poverty and find a way how to lift others from poverty as well. And he happened to land a job as a typesetter in a publication and printing shop. And that is where he had the enormous opportunity to start reading books. Books on Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Locke, Proudhon, Marx, Garibaldi, the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, until he started gelling his own ideas, beginning with how the railroad the development of the railroad could be oppressive to certain peoples. And among the peoples affected by the railroads were the displaced American Native Indians. And resettling farmers, while good for migrants, was quite adverse and unfair to the natives. Other than that, he also identified the Chinese workers as an oppressed people at the time. And so he he eventually owned a printing shop, he became a publisher. He floundered because he was also dabbling in politics. But he was making his ideas known, and he was confident enough to run for politics in California. He lost. But he managed to write his book when he received a sinecure as a gas meter writer, Progress and Poverty, which compiled all his thoughts on political economy. He saw that as populations grew and industries developed, include especially railroads connecting different towns and cities, the value of land also grew. And he asked, to whom does the value of land belong? Is the wealth of the land enhanced simply by ownership? No, it's enhanced by the cooperation of society over the locations. And so that got him famous. He moved to New York, ran for mayor, nearly won. His demand for his written and oral presentations grew. He was recognized by people like Leo Tolstoy, eventually Bertrand Russell, Sun Yat-sen, eventually Einstein. And he went as far as Australia. He went to Ireland to talk about the Irish problem. Went to Australia and found that Australia was actually applying the lessons he was teaching, particularly in site revenue, the taxation of land values, and free trade. And he was given pretty much a hero's welcome, which I can understand because based on the data I researched on, Australia and New Zealand, where he was popular, had the highest per capita incomes at the turn of the 20th century. And when he returned to New York, he made one more go for running for mayor and died in the process from a stroke. But nevertheless, his ideas were carried around the world. There are traces of his ideas applied in Meiji Japan, and the modern reform of Germany, the restructuring of the economy under the Weimar Republic using the Rentenmark, the rehabilitation of the city of Virgil in Austria by Mayor Unterguggenberger, who was inspired by the work of Silvio Gesell, who was inspired by Henry George, and also founders of countries like Sun Yat-sen and Jose Marti of Cuba. So I hope that's a good enough introduction to Henry George.
Yeah, thank you so much, because he really was an important, we can say, social reformer, a person who lived 100 years ago, and his ideas are not so well known today. For instance, in indigenous studies, we very little talk about his work and how did he recognize the wealth. And but in this room today, we have lots of people from sustainability science, from political economy. So please, now is your time to make questions. You can use the hand up function, or you can write your question in the chat. meanwhile, maybe you are still formulating your questions. I go on with my other question, my second question, and it's precisely about Henry George philosophy, because for me, the way how he understood the economic production, exchange, wealth, and so on, it's quite human-centered. It's very anthropocentric in a way, that the well-being of humans and the needs of humans are emphasized. So how do you see how his thoughts have been reflected among indigenous peoples? Because many indigenous peoples think in their philosophy, in their political demands, they really demand better decisions, political decisions for more than human beings, for non-humans, for animals and plants and the land, waters, and so on. So how do you see that? How is his idea human-centered, and how it has been?
Okay, thank you for that very provocative question. Henry George operates on a principle that render that to which is responsible for creating wealth to those who create wealth. All right, it's like render unto the worker what is due to the worker, which is just wages, which means if you work, you must not starve. That's first rule. Render unto the capital that is used unto the capital so it does not depreciate, because that's a natural default of capital. But also render unto society what is produced by the cooperation of society, so that society can produce more. And also, and this is stretching the idea of Henry George, render unto nature what is due to nature. So there is a responsibility in political economy, if one would really stretch the idea, the ethical idea of Henry George, to return unto nature what is due to nature. You do not deplete it. You do not destroy its nature. There is a responsibility to enhance it so that everyone's rights are also further enhanced. And for me, that's a very challenging area for Georgists to explore. You are right in a sense that it may seem anthropocentric. However, it is also the responsibility of humans to not destroy the bounties of nature and its ability to produce the bounties to even higher levels. So that is why I'm looking at the idea of the act of exchange as being efficient, according to Henry George. Exchange must result in a positive sum outcome.
Right, precisely. There is this space for dialogue, as you mentioned. F big, free, prior, informed consent, how it changes everything. I see. Any other questions from the participants? Is it too hot summer weather for you? Difficult to engage with academic discussions on the 30th of June?
There are some in the chat. Are there any on the chat? Okay. All right. No.
Yeah, no, that was Sophia's instructions. Any questions?
I would like to raise a question, and it may not be in the paper, and it's something to explore. How do people feel about the financialization and the monetization of the discourse in political economy with regard to in the indigenous peoples? because whereas before in early imperialist and colonial times, arms were used. If we recall what happened in South America, where the currencies were quinoa and coca beans, which meant that they did not have a central bank. They did not charge interest, and money grew on trees. The Europeans insisted that gold be the currency. So that really changes, that alters the whole paradigm. And the second alteration of the paradigm in imperialist times is whereas rent would be measured by harvests or outputs, when the colonizers or imperialists demand that their currency be used in paying rents and taxes, it immediately puts to a disadvantage the indigenous peoples, who will first have to sell their produce to earn money to pay for the taxes. And now you have, when in negotiating and transacting with indigenous peoples, a lot of financial figures are generated, much to the disadvantage of the indigenous peoples who have little or no money and do not have the same knowledge levels of finance as those who are negotiating against them. I would like to solicit any response from the audience with regard to that situation, because the purpose of the presentation I would like is to deepen the conversation in the same way the paper does not arrive at conclusions and or endings, but more new beginnings. So I would like to open that question to the participants in terms of new beginnings, doorways to areas of research. No takers?
Yeah, anyone, would you like to comment on what Joffre just presented? And we have here present, I know, people who are working in very different contexts. And in HELSUS, we have also different research themes. We have a theme on, besides the Global South, there is a research theme on the Arctic. There are people from that slot, and we have consumption and production, and theory and methodology in research, in sustainability research, and urban as a research theme. May I ask, I know that there are people who would have very interesting ideas on this question. May I ask Victoria, would you like to comment on the use of the lands and the economies, how they are constructed in the contemporary world?
Okay. Hey, Peter, can I comment?
Yes, I invited you because I think you would have
yes.
something to tell us, because you have been working in Tuva region. So I think that would be very, very interesting for us to hear. How do you see the question posed by Joffre? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joffre, for very interesting presentation. It's, of course, it's thought-provoking, and I have to honestly just say that I haven't been working much with the property laws in my context. So I am from the Tuva Republic. It is in Inner Asia. From 1944, it was annexed by the Soviet Union. Now it's part of Russia. But before that, we have been a part of China for almost 200 years. And before that, we have been part of all those nomadic states. So we have very interesting, actually, indigenous understandings of property, in particular land, as property. First of all, of course, it's similar with other indigenous peoples. People are very uneasy in approaching land as something with monetary value. And until recent, even during the socialist economics, when people somehow preserve their attitude to the land that it cannot be individual right for the land. And during socialism, it was more or less smooth because it was a collective farm, and collective farms in our place, they were made on the clan territories. It means that one collective farm usually consisted of the same clan members still living on the clan territories. So the land was used like collectively. And after the demise of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, of course, these things have changed. There is no the socialist economics anymore. And people were allowed to rent or even claim their hereditary rights for the land. And how people figured this out, it was kind of collective agreement to whose family particular pastures belong to. You didn't have to produce any paper to prove it. It was actually the community who was approving someone's rights for some pasture lands based on several generations of the same family inhabiting them in different seasons. So, and people could like register their land rights, like basically private land ownership, but not so many people have done it. And then laws in Russia about it have changed. So people now can just rent the land for pastures for like 49 years. So that is what my family, herders, and people whom I know they are doing now. They are renting their pasture lands for those 49 years. But here also, that registered official right for the land doesn't guarantee that it is only you who can use that land. All other people who live nearby, herders, still will use your pasture lands, even if you are the one who are paying taxes. And somehow it goes without conflicts because all other pastures are also shared in this way. People usually register property rights for the winter places where they build kind of warm structures like houses or shelters for the animals. All other seasonal pastures go without registered rights. So they're still in this collectively managed way of, I don't know, it's not even property, it's just collective management of land resources. So these kind of peculiar cases are still surviving in different parts of the world, I guess. And I think there is something to learn because this land management, it's very, this customary indigenous land management in Tuva, it's very complex structure because it takes into consideration the fertility of the pasture land and how much livestock can graze there. So, and all this somehow managed with, among the community without explicit agreements about it. So everybody has to consider someone else's rights and benefits, rights for benefiting from their pasture land. Yeah, so this kind of comment.
It's a very challenging situation. And the idea of land ownership takes two forms. One is, do we allow the state to be the owner of the land and decide what is best for us? And that wouldn't be Georgist because George explicitly was not a land nationalizer. What he was promoting was equality in rights, but it's not equality in rights in an anarchic manner, as many tend to misinterpret. The ownership or possession of land would be more an idea of what is called usufruct, USUFRUCT. Now this isn't in the paper, but it can lead in that direction. That usufruct is your right to use property that isn't yours. So you can consider land something that's not ours because we did not create it. But we have a right to it. and we have a right to apply our labor and capital and enjoy the fruits in doing so, but also with a responsibility that you do not harm others when you use it, such as don't pollute it, don't pollute the water, that will affect everyone else. Do not render it useless for any activity that other people will require livelihood for it, such as the forest behind Pirio. And also, no harm must arise by depriving others the use of the land because they have no other choice. So use of rock would demand that kind of perspective. It would be more akin to George because it defines your right to the land, that you don't own it, but you have a right to use it for your benefit, but not to the extent of harming anyone from its use or depriving anyone of its use. So I hope that that somehow puts into context the issues you raised, that just because the state says I own the land doesn't mean I have absolute exclusivity to it. Like in my experience in my family farm, when there would be indigenous peoples passing through the farm, they would ask, oh, can we have a chicken, or can we have these vegetables, some of these vegetables ready to harvest? We say, yes, by all means. We don't need the extra chicken. You do. We don't need the extra, we can't consume all the vegetables. You may need them. So we do not harm the indigenous peoples by depriving them of the use of the land to pass for just free passage and as a source of sustenance, nutrition. And in the same way, they do not damage any of our property that we have set up. So there has to be that element of not assertiveness, not ascendancy, but more mutual respect and honest to goodness cooperation, so that there is abundance for all rather than abundance for some and shortage for the others. That is something Georgists would avoid. I hope I helped. I know it's a very complicated issue, but that's the best way I can answer it for now.
Thanks so much. So now really challenging through different epistemological and ontological understandings and what is wealth. We have here a question by Hanna Kociemska about how to measure human development. So she is referring to the Human Development Index. Please go ahead, Hanna. Can you?
Thank you. I'm Hanna. Yes, I'm Hanna Kociemska. I'm representing Wrocław University of Economics and Business in Poland. And I'm just want you to congratulate. You have a very interesting research done. I'll be more than happy to read your paper in future. So please send it to us so that we can read all of it, as it seems to be very interesting for me. In particular, and my team, we're doing the research also human center, as you've mentioned before. And we're measuring the Human Development Index, which checking out how it is changing in all the societies, but we've never made any research particularly for the indigenous groups of people. And that's why interesting that maybe it will be highly valuable to see the changes in Human Development Index among the indigenous people, but depends whether they do possess the property or not, whether they do possess the land or not. Is there any difference between the Human Development Index in that two cases? It will be, I think, very intriguing to see whether this changes is. So maybe you can comment on this as well.
Okay, that's interesting. I remember it's more a personal experience where my grandfather worked with indigenous peoples, and he did not tell them that he's the owner of the land, but he wanted to start a coconut plantation and said, I would like to plant coconuts and harvest them. What will entice you to do that for me, with me? And they said, okay, feed us when we work for you, pay us a wage, and open a school where we can send our children to study. And I'm looking at the HDI in terms of their measures of years of schooling, expected years of schooling, life expectancy at birth, and gross national income. I mean, they're very empirical, and they might not mean anything to the indigenous peoples at all.
Exactly.
But when they say mean years of schooling, what kind of school do indigenous peoples attend in the first place? But what's important is really, number one, give them the choice. Number two, respect whatever choice they make. And third is enhance the continuing dialogue, because many of the indigenous peoples, I saw that as a child, but now many of them are more integrated into schools. They do want to study. They do want to be integrated into modern society, but they do not want to lose their sense of identity, and they want to be respected for whom they are. And that's where I feel that the Human Development Index falls short. That it is somehow forcing a certain key performance indicator to, without due respect to the situation or context of a society, a community that has managed to preserve its way of life, its Weltanschauung, its paradigm, its traditions, cultures, and even identity. For that is an accomplishment in itself that must be acknowledged. And many practices that they have in their own political economy has been helpful to the environment, such as how the Aboriginal peoples in Australia managed to prevent further forest fires. Now, which universities teach a skill like that?
Exactly.
It's not measured by the number of years of school. I think what it should measure is the corresponding benefit their lives provide society. That is what's lacking.
Exactly.
Because depriving them of the possession of land could be depriving our own world, our own communities, the benefits that we take for granted, such as our climate, our natural ecological cycles.
Thank you so much, Joffre. Yeah, and there are, of course, collective rights to the lands that indigenous people have, and many studies, they show that the land is really pivotal. It's really the fundamental element for protecting cultural heritage, for protecting the health of beings, for securing the diversity of life, not only in the lands, but also in the planet. So the land is really, really pivotal for many indigenous peoples. But for instance, in the Amazon, where I've been working for almost 20 years, the ownership is, even if it's in the paper, it's a collective ownership. The ownership is not understood in human terms. For the people with whom I've been working, the ownership is beyond the human. It's in the hand of animals and plants and so on that actually produce the oxygen and give life for other beings. We thank you so much, Joffre, and all the participants who came on this hot summer day to participate in a Zoom event. Thank you so much.
Thank you also. The pleasure is all mine.
Thank you. Have a nice summer, a relaxing one. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice summer.
Thank you.